Welcome to TCN Talks. The goal of our podcast is 15 to 20 minutes of relevant, need-to-know information to help you in your role as a hospice, palliative care, and serious illness leader, and for the team at all levels of the organization. Our goal is concise and relevant information because brevity signals respect. And the bookends of our podcast are always something to make you think deeper about life, about our topic, or both. And now, here's Chris Comeaux.
Hello and welcome. Before we get started today, I want to thank our sponsor, DeltaCare RX. They're the title sponsor for 2023, our TCN Leadership Immersion course, and also all of our TCN Talks podcasts. DeltaCare RX is primarily known as a national hospice PBM and a prescription mail order company. DeltaCare RX is a premier vendor of TCN, and they provide not only pharmaceutical care, but also niche software innovations that save their customers time, stress, and money. Thanks to DeltaCare RX and their great team and all the great work that they do in hospice, into life care, serious illness care. Also, just a quick plug, our next TCN Leadership Immersion course is the week of May 1st. This training has been reviewed as some of the most potent and powerful leadership training hospice and palliative care leaders have ever been through. Join us. Go to Teleos. You'll see the link, TELEIOSCN.org, and look at courses. Also, whatever platform you're listening to our podcast on, be sure to follow us so you don't miss any of the great episodes that we have planned for 2023. So our guest today, and back again, and is going to be back quite a bit this year, is Mark Cohen. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Chris. Welcome. Glad to be here.
Yeah, Mark, why don't you share with our folks something that they need to know about you, or what would be good to know about you?
Well, unlike a lot of people in hospice, I've been doing media management, media monitoring my entire career in public relations, which let's just say is north of 40 years at this point. Even with all the changes in the media in the last couple decades, it's still important. It's still time consuming. It's still challenging to do. It's like treasure hunting to find the nuggets that are important that can guide somebody in terms of managing issues. But I believe it's still an important skill, and I'm glad that I've been able to do it my whole career.
Well, Mark, that's a thank you, first off. Thank you for the work that you do. I had the privilege we had a meeting, and I got to get really a good look under the hood about the work that you do to produce Hospice News Today. Oh my God, Mark, you do the work of at least like almost, 2.5 people easily to produce that. And what I realize now, this is a labor of love in terms of what you do. And it's such a great kind of culmination of the things that you've done throughout your career, and just how incredibly gifted it is that you sift through all these resources and then kind of produce the Hospice News Today. You do it 365. You try to get it out early in the morning for leaders to actually read. And so just my hat's off to you. I have a deeper appreciation. And that's actually why Mark and I are going to do a show each month this year. This is our first one. It's going to be the top news stories. So this is the top news stories from January 2023. One, it'll really highlight the hard work that Mark does. But two, it'll be a great resource to hospice leaders. This is what you need to know. A couple years ago for Christmas, my wife gave me a really cool bookmark for Christmas. And it actually talked about how there are even rhythms in history, and that there's certain times in history when all of this change kind of comes through. And the last time was like the early 1900s. We think about, I have a slide that I use quite frequently. Can you see the one car on the street? And 10 years later, can you see the one horse? It was in downtown Chicago. And it's a great visual for how much change happened during that time. Well, I think we live at that time again, and we're in terms of that rhythm of history, where these next 7 to 10 years. And so leaders of hospice, palliative care, serious illness, knowing what's going on is critical. And I'm sure a lot of folks, Mark, you probably get this feedback. Well, I love your newsletter, but I just don't have time to read it. Well, if you don't make the time, you really are hamstringing yourself at a time when leaders need to know. So this will be an additional resource for them. And we're going to do this each month this year in terms of the top news stories. So Mark, you ready?
Sure I am.
So I've asked Mark, and he and I end up in the same place. We're going to shoot for the top 10-ish news articles over the month. Mark will go first. I'll go afterwards. I may ask him some questions. He may ask me some questions. And I did 10-ish because it's funny, Mark and I kind of planned, but I couldn't pick 10, neither could he. So Mark, why don't you go first?
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris. Well, as an introduction, your comments about the cycle of history and the cycle of news media are right on. I see it every day in terms of the ebb and flow of stories. Topic that was hot 6 months ago has fallen off the radar screen mostly today. So some general observations. The negatives about hospice in the last month outweigh the positives in the media coverage. It's the beginning of the year, which means most state legislatures are back in session, which means that issues that state legislatures deal with are in the news. Labor issues from contracts and strikes to burnout and staffing ratios are continuing to escalate. And as we approach the new normal, whatever that is, in terms of COVID, that's being reflected in the coverage in a lot of ways. So with that, I will start my top 10 list. I did 10 and then had honorable mention of about a half a dozen. Top 10 most important story is the fallout from the December report by ProPublica on fraud in the hospice sector, particularly as perpetrated by what I call fly-by-night for-profit hospices. The author did not call them fly-by-night, but they very clearly meet the definition of fly-by-night. 10 hospices working out of the same office and not really doing anything other than billing Medicare.
Monitoring it from Ring doorbell, right? I mean, gosh.
It was really amazing. And you know, the Los Angeles Times reported the same story basically 2 years ago. So it's been out there, which is an important compliment or an important sidebar to this story. My number 2 story is physician-assisted suicide, medical aid, and dying. I had 34 articles and columns about that subject in the newsletter through yesterday for the month of January. And that's because the legislatures are in session. It is on the docket in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. Particularly, but it's even been raised in a state with a conservative governor and a very conservative legislature like Florida. The issue is very definitely not going away. There's an attack on physician-assisted suicide in Montana by the conservatives who now control the legislature out there. And in states that do have physician-assisted suicide, medical aid, and dying, there are some legislative attempts to broaden the law as well. And that also includes coverage from Canada, where they're also looking at significant liberalization of their medical aid and dying law. On the same vein of what are legislatures doing, my number 3 was medical marijuana. 14 stories in the last month about medical marijuana. About 2/3 of the states have legalized medical marijuana. The 1/3 of the states that have not are very politically conservative. But there are still efforts in a number of those states, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, as 3 examples, where advocates who are both on the progressive side, but also some libertarians and also some people who are just run-of-the-mill conservatives, but have had a bad experience with pain management and for whatever it is, whether it's end-of-life care or whether it's a chronic condition, and see the need for it. So this issue, again, is not going away. Number 4 on my list, staffing shortages across the entire continuum of care. Most particularly probably nursing homes in the number 1 slot, followed by hospitals, followed by home health and hospice. Related to that, nurse burnout. 17 articles in the last month about nurses going on strike, nurses organizing, nurses in contentious contract negotiations, staffing issues related to nurse burnout, nurses objecting to working conditions and staffing ratios in their places of work. And a new issue that popped up, number 6 on my list at the end of the month, credential fraud among nurses. Um, the U.S. Attorney in Florida busted 3 private schools that basically were giving people phony diplomas and coaching them on how to pass their nursing licensure exams. They estimate that there's more than 7,000 nurses in the country who have those fraudulent credentials and likely are not qualified to be practicing. The first state at the end of last week, Delaware, suspended about a little over 24 nurse licenses that were held by nurses who've gone through these programs. This issue is just beginning right now for folks in healthcare. Number 7 on my list is all the problems associated, challenges associated with rural healthcare and rural healthcare deserts, hospitals closing, a lot of skilled nursing facilities closing. It was a important article on the impact of the pharmacist and pharmacy tech shortage in rural areas in the last month. It's an ongoing issue. It obviously affects a relatively small percentage of the population, but it affects a huge percentage of the geography of the United States. Number 8 on my list is death doulas. 7 articles last month about death doulas. And the thing that I think puts us on the radar screen is that so many times these articles about death doulas describe what the doulas do as if all hospice does is enroll people and send a nurse once a month and provide no psychosocial care, no emotional support, no family support. And the only one who can do that is a death doula. And I think there's a lot of risk there for hospices. You know, some hospices have started to partner with death doulas, and I think that's a great thing, but I think there are a lot of independent death doulas out there who are misrepresenting what a good hospice provider, whether that's a for-profit or a not-for-profit, what a good hospice provider actually does for the patients and families enrolled in their care. Number 9 on my list is Certificate of Need. Libertarian interests funded by the Koch brothers continue to attack Certificate of Need. The irony, in conjunction with the number 1 story, the ProPublica fallout, which is centered in states that do not have Certificate of Need laws, that combination can't be ignored. The question that isn't being asked by hospice interests that benefit from strong Certificate of Need laws is, do you really want our state to look like California and the Wild West? Do you really want our state to look like Nevada and Arizona? Yet conservative libertarian interests continue to push editorial columns that argue against Certificate of Need, and there's very little pushback from the hospice sector, from the nursing home sector against that argument. And number 10 on my list is mergers and acquisitions, particularly the bump in the road as it's being described with state attorneys general and possibly the federal government raising objections to the planned acquisition of one of the largest for-profit hospice and home health providers, LHC Group, by United Healthcare's Optum subsidiary. Could have implications for a lot of M&A news down the line. So those are my top 10. I don't know if you want me to hand it off to you, Chris, or
no,
just
do your
give
honorable mention first, and then I'll do mine.
Okay. My honorable mentions were COVID-19, booster rates, and changes in procedures. Your standard opening and closing of inpatient care units and comfort homes around the country. M&A in terms of for-profit conversions and very small deals in very small markets. Skilled nursing facility closings across the geography, not just rural. Hospitals starting to report revenue issues now that they're not receiving any COVID money. You're starting to see some significant cuts by hospitals, which will affect, which likely will start to see rollbacks in service. My next honorable mention is layoffs. We're starting to see some significant layoff announcements in the hospital sector. That's both a risk and an opportunity for hospice providers, frankly. And the last honorable mention is caregiving. Legislative efforts to support caregivers, continuing focus on the inequalities faced by caregivers, predominantly older, predominantly female, and just the staffing issues as they affect home health and how those affect caregivers in the home because they're not getting the support from home health that they ought to get, but they can't find any home health provider to come into the home. So those are my honorable mentions, all worth keeping on the radar screen if you're a hospice leader, in my opinion.
Well, Mark, thank you. We didn't give each other a rubric, but now that I actually think about you doing it, of course, yours is more quantitative based, and a lot of people don't realize you spend hours, 3 hours or so, sifting all these articles, and then that's how you produce Hospice News Today. So mine was a little bit less like quantitative, the number that I saw, but ones that felt important. I work with 13 different hospice CEOs, even more than that in our Telios consulting group. So, and I didn't number mine, so maybe I'll talk about that going forward. So this is in no particular order. So I've picked 10, and then I have a few honorable mentions. And so again, no certain order. First one that jumped out at me over the month was, and what I'm doing is I'm saving them throughout the month. Like, okay, this one feels big. So I save them in a certain folder. Then I go back. I had like 25, and then I narrowed them down and show prep for the 10. Actually, it's 11. And then the honorable mention. So the first is Medisys CEO Paul Cusero. If conveners don't change, their day is coming to an end. And it's interesting because I've kind of seen this as certain companies that try to position themselves between providers and the actual payer. This really does rub on providers. And basically, broadly, conveners are the middlemen between home-based care providers and MA plans. At their best, they make it easier for providers to conduct business and make it easier for plans to work. But at their worst, which is what home health providers' focus has been of late, is they're skimming off the top already low MA rates. So obviously a Medisys CEO coming from a little bit more of a home health background, but literally pretty strong words. If they don't change, their day is coming to an end. So that was one of the ones I picked. Next one, more for its futuristic implications. Jetson-style robots were invading Chicago area hospitals amid worker shortage. And so this was the robot's name was Moxie at Elmhurst Hospital in Chicago. And basically it's delivering medical supplies and things throughout the actual hospital. And they're doing this because of the labor shortage and trying to take some of that lower end work off of staff. So I thought that was pretty interesting. The other that you alluded to, look who's standing up to bad actor hospice providers. So we had 4 associations, NOC, NHPCO, National Hospice Partnership for Healthcare and Hospice Innovation, and Leading Age come together, generated because of the ProPublica article, and really standing up and saying, well, here's some things that need to occur. Targeted moratorium on new hospices, revoke Medicare enrollment for new operational hospices, develop a list of hospice red flag criteria, put certain new hospices into a high-risk survey category, prohibit individuals with convictions for certain crimes from serving as hospice administrators, include several additions to the Care Compare website, such as regular updates to the date of hospice certification and change of ownership, and then identify the role of hospice special focus program and upcoming rulemaking. So that's a big one. For those 4 organizations to come together, pretty unprecedented. Another one, in fact, 2 that are related, but this one, MA plans benefiting from departures from traditional plans. So a study found in 2016 more Medicare enrollees migrated from MA plans to traditional. But then 2017 to 2020, that trend reversed with more enrollees moving from traditional plans to Medicare Advantage plans at roughly 4 times the rate. Transferring accounted for a growing share of new MA enrollment growth, increasing from 49% in 2016 to 67% in 2020. Another interesting thing in that article, the study found that also Black and Hispanic beneficiaries switched at a greater rate than white. So that was really interesting. And then another article over the month, MA plans offering in-home support services increased by 32% in 2023. So that's a pretty big trend. And this is one reason why I see certain peers actually getting to the private duty home care business. And then next one that I chose, and again, this is what I love, that Mark and I kind of have two different viewpoints. Healthcare vendors are the new front of cybersecurity war. Cyber criminals seeking to seize sensitive healthcare information are increasingly targeting vulnerable vendors. So effectively what they do is they hold these healthcare entities hostage until they pay the ransom. Patient, docs, the whole system can't get into electronic health record. And so that's a increasing trend. And then here's another one that popped out to me the month, the fight over how to deliver bad news to patients. So Congress was full of good intentions when it directed the Department of Health and Human Services to make sure patients get their results as soon as possible. But the implementation of that directive has set off a battle between doctors on one side and HHS and patient advocates on the other. They've raised a fundamental question. How should patients get their bad news? Imagine if you go into a portal and you get a major diagnosis and that's how you find out about that. On one hand, trying to get transparency, but on the other hand, there's got to be a better way than you just going on, and that's how you find out. So that was kind of an interesting one that I think is going to continue to play out. And then, Mark, this is one you and I both picked, why the U.S. nursing shortage keeps getting worse. And this one actually drew a comparison. It's not just the U.S. Nurses in both the U.S. and U.K. flexed their bargaining muscle over the last few weeks amid increasing pressure on the country's respective healthcare system due to COVID-19. So you see a lot more kind of labor organizing. Actually, where I live, not too far, Asheville, North Carolina, it's had a lot of interesting things as you've ended up with unionized nursing in a fairly conservative place, Western North Carolina as a whole, although Asheville is a little bit different. But that we've seen that locally where I live. So moving on to my last couple, the realities of PACE expansion, a potential opportunity for home-based providers. So talking about how PACE has been touted as not only a major opportunity for home-based care providers, but also a risk and value-based program that works for seniors when done right. So just encouraging a lot of home care providers to look at PACE. Mark, I was recently at Home Care 100, and that was being highlighted as well. And then my last two, and then I'll mention my honorable mention. This one more because of the disruptive innovation implication. So Teladoc Health wraps up their Livongo merger with a new app launch at the Consumer Electronics Show. And so pretty powerful merger of Teladoc and Livongo. If you just look at both their business models, both a huge disruptor innovator to healthcare as a whole. I think that it was, the Teladoc acquired Livongo for $18.5 billion. So you're seeing major dollars come together in this kind of interesting merger. And then last one, United Healthcare Group views home health as the new frontier of value-based care. So as you mentioned, Mark, the LHC Group acquisition, but this just talks about from the upper echelon of United, they view home health as a whole new frontier. In other words, care in the home for value-based care, et cetera. So those are my top ones. Let me actually look at my honorable mentions. Again, this was a tough job to kind of narrow these down. And so kind of the honorable mentions were hospital use of volunteer staff runs the risk of skirting labor laws. So it was just one article, but talking about for-profit hospitals utilizing volunteers and how that might be challenging because they're for-profit as opposed to nonprofit. The Death Doulage jumped out at me. It was a great article about Hospice of Baton Rouge and how they've actually highlighted one of the most nationally known death doulas. And then just a whole host of, hospital revenues had a slight uptick, and so their negative margin went from like 3% to like, I think it upticked by like 0.2%. So as you said earlier, that's going to be something to watch throughout this year. Also, kind of correlated to your CON one, the New York governor vetoed a bill to prevent for-profit hospices from expanding and growing, which feels counterintuitive to the whole ProPublica article. And then last one, Mark, this is kind of a tip of the hat to your background, but also for seasons where I got to spend a long portion of my career. But a real pioneer. We're losing the last of the pioneers, and so Esther Cauliflower passed away in January. You knew Esther really well. I had the privilege of knowing her as well. She actually died under the care of Four Seasons, and just a dynamo. And there are not too many of those pioneers left. When I think of all the ones over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've lost a lot of the initial folks that I know I've benefited from. I've spent a whole career doing this work. And so those are the ones I've chose. Any questions on those, Mark?
Well, I think some interesting comments on the New York Governor Kathy Hochul vetoing the bill to prevent for-profits. New York is a CON state. We generally have one provider per market area. I live in New York. I live in upstate New York, and utilization in New York is horrible. It's one of the worst. It's likely the worst in the country. It's one of the bottom 3. There's a lot of reasons for that, but when you read the governor's veto message, she said that she would not approve that bill because of low utilization, she didn't want to tie the state's hands to look at ways to improve utilization. So a unique situation. New York is sort of the textbook case as to how CON doesn't necessarily create large, thriving, quality providers. It's the counterpoint to a Florida or a North Carolina, frankly. The two top 10 article or top 11 that you picked, MA plans offering in-home support services, and then the realities of PACE expansion. We are seeing, not so much in the media yet, but on the listservs posted by the National PACE Association, you are seeing local PACE providers complaining that they are losing enrollees, or they are seeing a decline in their rate of enrollment as Medicare Advantage plans come in and offer a lot of the perks that PACE programs are offering. And I think there might be a reckoning coming down the line.
That's really interesting, because those MA plans are really smart about marketing, which is typically not a core competency of a PACE program. Right.
But I've seen comments posted on the MPA listserv. We've lost 5 people this month. They're going to MA plans, and what is anybody doing about it? Nobody's found the silver bullet on that. And then I did want to comment on your picking up the hospital use of volunteer staff runs a risk of skirting hospital labor laws. And I actually want to relate it back to the ProPublica mess. And that is, I think not-for-profit hospices ought to get on the bandwagon of abolishing the 5% rule for use of volunteers in hospice care. And the reason for that is, if the rule goes away, the not-for-profits won't change the way they do business. The fly-by-night for-profits won't have to lie outright about what they're doing, and they just won't bother to hire a volunteer manager and go through the charade of having volunteers. And the good for-profits may see the value of meeting the 5% goal so that they can say that they are providing care similar to what their not-for-profit competitors provide, or they might slowly start to slip back. I think it becomes a differentiator for not-for-profits.
That's a great point.
And I just, if there are 1,000 hospices in California right now, how many of them are actually doing 1% of their patient care with volunteers, let alone 5%? I think it's another reform idea that if I were a large not-for-profit, or if I were a credible for-profit, I would actually want to get behind that. I don't know why we want to, what the value is to having fly-by-night for-profit hospices lying about the amount of volunteer coverage they're providing.
Wow. Well, Mark, always fascinating. I can't wait. We're going to do this each month. So thanks for your time today, Mark. And I want to thank
Chris. It was fun.
Yeah, I thank our listeners. And as I always do, I'll leave you with a quote. This one from Martin Eakes. If you focus 20% externally and 80% internally, you'll rot from the inside out. Thanks for listening to TCN Talks.